will the USA default? Is the USA debt sustainable? And is it morally acceptable to set the next generations with a crippling national debt?
Will the US default? Look, I mean, I think what everyone is trying to do here, and this is why we hear so much, and I'm going to talk a bit more generally rather than just at the US, but I'll come back to the US, but this is why there's this obsession with creating inflation, and there's, you know, everyone's sort of so worried that there's no inflation around, and, you know, so European CPI is sort of what, like below, it's certainly below 1%. It's certainly below the 2% that the ECB has as a target, and the Fed has 2% the CPI as a target, and the Bank of England has 2% as a target. And, you know, everyone's looking at these figures and they're all below target, and they're sort of getting into a big lather about it. But on the other side, they're saying, well, isn't it great we haven't got inflation, and despite all the quantitative easing and monetary stimulus, so we can, you know, so they could carry on doing it. But the point is that they want to create inflation, even though it's not good for you or me, unless we are in debt to some extent, but they want to create inflation to get rid of their own debt. Now, actually, inflation isn't particularly, you know, because in that way they can inflate away the debt burden. So that's why you want to create inflation. So it's by creating inflation that you sort of get into the situation where you sort of lessen the debt burden, and hopefully then you're not in a position where you're going to default. And I mean, I can't see the US sort of getting into the position where it would default. So that's one thing.
Okay. Is the USA debt sustainable?
I don't see how the US debt is sustainable. No. Because, you know, the US continues to add to its debt. But, you know, having said that, there are countries out there in a much worse situation, with a much worse debt burden, and with, you know, if you look at sort of their economies, in a really much more vulnerable position. So I wouldn't be too concerned about the US situation as it stands now. I think it's awful. But, you know, I think that the expression is it's the sort of the cleanest shirt in the laundry. You know, it really is. I mean, if you want to look at countries where you've got a very, very serious debt problem, and actually very little chance of sort of getting out of it, let's look at Japan, or look at some of sort of, you know, some of the weaker members of the Eurozone. That's where it's a problem, or even the UK. But, you know, I think for the US, I mean, again, because of its natural resources, because of its demographics, you know, it's, and actually, although you know, a lot of Americans complain about you know, the sort of the taxes and everything else, I mean, they're in a lot better position than we are in the UK, or people are in Europe, or certainly than Japan is.
Mm. Do you think it's morally acceptable to set the next generations with such crippling national debt?
I think it's absolutely unacceptable. I think it's an absolute disgrace that we load future generations with this kind of debt. I think it's appalling. I suppose, you know, thinking about it, the sort of like the debt burden has really been building for us, you know, since the Second World War. And, you know, certainly for sort of my parents' generation, you know, I wouldn't begrudge them a thing in terms of sort of in terms of their pensions and everything else, and the quality of life that they've hoped they've had, and have done so much to build, you know, since the end of the Second World War. And bear in mind, my parents, you know, are elderly, but you know, going forward, you know, the sort of, you know, we aren't choosing to take on this debt. It's, you know, it's sort of our governments, the people that we elected, are doing this on our behalf. But you know, without the buy or leave to us, I mean, they're just saying this has to be done. This is what we have to do to save the world, in Gordon Brown's words. You know. But, you know, we don't have a choice in this matter, because no one's offering any alternative or anything different. But, you know, long and short, no, I think it's appalling. I think it's absolutely dreadful.
So, I mean, you know, you don't think it will happen, but if the US collapses, will the rest of the world follow?
Oh yes, I mean, well, I don't think the rest of the world would follow a US collapse, because I think that the rest of the world would have already collapsed ahead of the US. I mean, I think that's probably the sequence of events. I don't quite know what you would consider to be a collapse. You know, I mean, I suppose you could say, well, we almost saw it with some of the peripheral European markets, with sort of the likes of Greece and Cyprus and Portugal and whatever. And I suppose what we're talking about here is a point where, you know, bond yields get start to sort of go up, and you know, we see sort of those yields just carry on going until, you know, they hit unsustainable levels. And then what do you do? And you know, how do you? I mean, I suppose the first thing we're going to see before we see a collapse in the US is a breakup of Europe. That's what I would expect.
Peace and prosperity around the world depend on a strong America. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, well, I mean, yes, I suppose they do. I suppose they do. We had this thing of Pax Americana, didn't we? But you know, America has a tendency, as we saw back, you know, in the 20s, to row back in and become isolationist. And then after it became isolationist, you know, as it was becoming isolationist, it then sort of started to erect trade barriers. And I think, you know, that if that were to happen, and America did become more isolationist, and then sort of the trade barriers came up, then I think this would be a terrible thing for the world. Because I mean, I think one of the most important things that we can do is to do anything to ease free trade, to take down barriers, to destroy regulations. You know, this is how we gain trust in each other. It's by trading with each other, meeting with each other, communicating. And if you put up those barriers, then I mean, I think this is a very, very serious thing. So I mean, America is, you know, the trouble with the US is that it's damned if it does, and it's damned if it doesn't. You know, on the one hand, there are people who cry up and say we don't want to see the US as the world's policeman and doing this, that, and the other. But then again, when something terrible does happen, as it has happened in Syria, or everyone's crying out for American intervention. So you know, in some respects, the US can't win. But I think what we ought to, you know, what would be a real concern is if America did draw up the drawbridge and said, "Get on with it." Mm.